Welcome back. The US and Europe, what transatlantic alliance the world needs. This year NATO expanded, Finland became the new member, and Sweden is with one foot at the entry door. What that means for the remaining neutral countries in the Europe, how the European architecture of the security will look in the nearest future. The speakers of the next panel are Thomas Countryman, Board Chairman, Arms Control Association, Rizzo, Nonresident Senior Fellow at Atlantic Council's Europe Center, Milan, Senior Research Fellow in the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia and Central Asia, and the German Council on Foreign Relations, and Eric Nelson, Associate Director of the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Moderator in this panel is Ms. Rosa Balfour, Director of Carnegie Europe. Please welcome to the stage.
Right.
Rachel, sit in the middle.
Yes, please.
All right.
So good morning and welcome to this discussion. We've talked a lot about security, we've talked about NATO, we've talked about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've talked about security in the Balkans, but perhaps slightly tangentially during the last couple of days. So now we have a session really to look at how the security architecture has changed in Europe as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So there are plenty of things to talk about. I'd first like to just do a little rain check. How have things changed over the past year or so? I'd like to start with Eric, if you can tell us. I mean, there have been major changes, but perhaps still a few areas that are complicated. Would you like to tell us, starting from the big changes with respect to NATO in particular?
Well, Rose, I think it's amazing what's changed and what has remained the same. What are the constant truths? Mm-hmm. What's changed is NATO is rising and more relevant than ever. We have Finland and Sweden deciding that neutrality is not adequate for them to protect themselves in today's Europe. We see that NATO is as necessary as ever. It's a military alliance which is not in competition with the European Union, but is complementary to the European Union. We see tremendous new coordination between Brussels and Washington, between NATO and the EU, that together they have an obligation to protect the Europe. And we're reminded that the security that NATO delivered, NATO has delivered for nearly 75 years to Europe, is the foundation of the prosperity and the legal security that the EU has been able to fulfill. And whether NATO and Europe can be safe and free without that strong military alliance, we're seeing, as Ukraine, we consider what Ukraine's future is, how essential NATO is. Is there adequate security guarantee without that Article 5 protection for anyone in Europe? So NATO is as relevant as ever, and here we're talking a lot about the Western Balkans, and I think we need to remember how the role that NATO has played for European integration in this region, and we need to embrace that. We have 4 new members of NATO from Albania and the former Yugoslavia. That's tremendous progress. And right now, we've discussed, several panels have mentioned there's several layers of European coordination from the EPC, the OSCE, EU, NATO. And right now, we talk a lot about European integration being the EU's responsibility for this region. And I think we need to not buy into Putin's objectives of saying, well, NATO's done, we're not really promoting NATO's advancement. But I think Ambassador Hill put it clearly yesterday, that the best future for the Western Balkans is that all of the Balkans are part of NATO and the EU. And we need to take that on as NATO members. Remember that that is the vision. And remember that NATO's promise is collective security benefits everybody. And that realization needs to be made in Serbia as well. And that's a lot of work, but I think it's a big challenge that I'm happy to talk more about, but let me stop there.
Thank you, Eric. I would like to talk a little bit more about NATO, the Western Balkans, and security here, and also the degree to which NATO enlargement and EU enlargement dovetail with each other, both historically but also looking forward. But also your comments about NATO enlargement, Baltic security, eastern flank, and now we're seeing also conflict in the Middle East. I think there's a broader question, and here I'd like to ask Tom if this is the security architecture that the world needs, doubling down on the transatlantic relationship and everything that has been built since the end of the Second World War, or do we need to address additional issues, additional questions?
Well, the short answer is yes. NATO has again demonstrated that it is essential to the defense of the European continent. Three ways in which NATO is forced to refocus. First, Mr. Putin's war of territorial conquest has expanded NATO, but has unified it as well around its original purpose, which is to defend European democracies against aggression from the East. That's very important because history is full of examples of heavily armed groups with no clear mission who just end up getting themselves into trouble. Second, the war in Ukraine has forced NATO to focus again on defense spending and choosing the right kind of defense spending. In Ukraine, we've seen that simple artillery shells are perhaps more important than the most complex fighter jet. Spending on defense can temporarily and artificially stimulate an economy, as we see in Russia right now, but it doesn't create the same kind of long-term productivity and growth. Unfortunately, it's unavoidable that we have to spend more on defense items, including of the simple variety. And third implication for me, I think in everything written about Ukraine, not enough attention is being paid to the fact that Russia is systematically violating international law in the humanitarian sphere. We had Geneva Conventions and other international agreements after World War II to address the fact that nearly every combatant in World War II purposely attacked civilians and civilian infrastructures. Russia is doing that on a massive scale today. It cannot be ignored. Now, I hope NATO never has to go to war, but this is also the moment in which NATO and individual countries have to make sure that any war planning they do incorporates these crucial requirements of international humanitarian law.
Thank you very much for raising that, actually. And of course, there's a whole new debate now with what is happening in the Middle East about humanitarian law. So, Rachel, I'd like to turn to you and ask you a few questions about the United States. So before coming on stage, Rachel was remarking that this wasn't exactly what the Biden administration was hoping to deal with when it entered into office in early 2021. How has US policy changed? What are the priorities? We also saw that the US was not convinced about the idea of Ukraine's accession to NATO. Can you just decode us a little bit the priorities coming from Washington?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the last few years has looked very different than I think Biden and his team had planned on. They had a few, I think, overarching goals coming into office. You know, the first was obviously to reassure very anxious allies who had felt like the United States was a mercurial partner over the 4 years of Trump's presidency. They wanted to turn their attention to the Indo-Pacific region. They wanted to park Russia. That was a stated goal. So park Russia as in sort of not make that a centerpiece of their foreign policy, put guardrails on the relationship, make it predictable. And they wanted to build a foreign policy for the middle class. And so I think when you sort of look at those overarching goals, one of them certainly has not gone according to plan, and that is the Park Russia aspect of Biden's foreign policy. And what I think that has done is sort of resulted in competing priorities and muddled messaging from the administration. Although I do think, and I would like to say that Biden and his team deserve a whole lot of credit for the leadership they've shown, both in NATO, on Ukraine. I don't think that that Europe and the United States would have been able to hold together such a strong coalition in supporting Ukraine had it not been for the United States in the lead. But there's also been a lack of stated strategic goals, as supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. I think we're seeing is not a message that really resonates for the American public in the long term. We've sort of seen support for Ukraine on the decline. And I think what that has done is sort of given the China first policymakers and analysts in the Washington, D.C. space sort of room to push this message that the United States cannot and should not be doing both, that we can't both focus on supporting Ukraine and focus on China. I don't think you can totally ignore that point, but I do think it's misguided in a few different ways. But one thing that I think has gone according to plan is this idea of a foreign policy for the middle class. And when you look at the legislation that has been passed, the CHIPS and Science Act, Build Back Better, the Inflation Reduction Act, this is also in service of the American people, but it's also to revitalize the U.S. manufacturing center so that we can compete with China. It's a very clear, I think, goal for the United States. And so what this means for Europe, I think, is that we need to be a little bit more clear-eyed. I think Europe needs to be a little bit more clear-eyed about where the U.S.'s strategic focus is going to be in the coming year and maybe the next 4 years. And I don't want to, drive home the message that Europe needs to step up to the plate. I think we say that a little bit too much, but I think it is true.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen that insofar as Ukraine is concerned, Europeans are actually stepping up to the challenge more so than they were a year ago, and next week there's going to be a EU-US summit. But looking forward to 2024, we've got a difficult year ahead, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. But not before I turn to Milan. I'd like to ask you about the situation in the Balkans, because we've seen rising tensions, we've seen a deterioration of the security situation. What can we expect from NATO in the region? What can we expect in terms of tensions here? And to what extent is leadership in the Balkans taking seriously the new international security situation and Europe's security architecture?
Thank you, Rosa, for these questions. Thank you for the organizers for having me. And I wonder how much we want to unpack in this first round. I think the one thing that should be stated clearly is that there is a full-scale war in Europe which determines everything. And it will shape, reshape, reconfigure also situation here in the Western Balkans, because it rests on the security in the Western Balkans rests on NATO and on peace settlements from the 1990s, which with unfinished business in some areas which are now becoming very fragile flashpoints. And this is in the context of whole international situation which is becoming even more unpredictable. See Hamas attack, and you see fragility and vacuum being explored. What happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was coming. I mean, Azerbaijan, since December, when they sent their people to the Lachin corridor, was preparing this. And they changed the situation on the ground just by exploring vacuum and exploring also the fact that US and Europe were distracted. And if you have one war, full-scale war in Europe as the central piece of everything, of decision-making, then local players tend to sort of push the limit to see how far they can get away with. And I think this is what's happening in North Kosovo. So to bridge this with the conversation that was supposed, I think, to happen yesterday at the envoys panel, but they were ditching some questions because it's still very fragile. Let me try to, it's risky, but let me try to now connect the security questions in Europe, so European security and the fragile situation in North Kosovo. I think North Kosovo is now much more explosive than Bosnia-Herzegovina. I think these are two fragile situations. Again, everything rests on NATO, security there, in North Kosovo on KFOR, and also on the US commitment and presence in Europe, which will be taken under question mark, I think, with the presidential elections next year. So there is a waiting game by leaders, I think, for the outcome of the war in Ukraine and for the US elections. It's still a lot of time until clarity on both, or more clarity. So maybe let me finish by just saying that the evolving situation in the north of Kosovo has not started by Banska. There was a decision, I mean, it's a looming crisis up and down for a year or more. As the EU and Gabriel Escobar, US, and were pushing for a breakthrough agreement. And in Ohrid, they achieved, on paper, a breakthrough. At the same time, there were escalation on the ground. But we have a situation, to put it very simply, where there was a decision of Serbs in Kosovo to withdraw from Kosovo institutions. Decision either blessed or even pushed from Belgrade. I think it was a huge mistake, because they created a vacuum in North Kosovo, which was explored by the Kurti government, who sent special forces. Sending special forces in the bases in North Kosovo is changing it's a game changer. Mm-hmm. And then the Banska incident with a lot of arms, maybe starting some rebellion, whatever the plan was, we can speculate. I looked at the Kumanova agreement. Now we have to look at the basics. And the Kumanova agreement says that the mandate of the KFOR commander is almost unlimited. He can send KFOR forces to the north. Maybe it was an attempt that completely sort of turned around and misfired by Belgrade to lure KFOR forces to provide security in the north for Kosovo Serbs in the north that are seeing special forces of Kosovo there and feel insecure. Now, security of Kosovo Serbs, also in the south, relies on KFOR and on NATO. That's the paradox of the situation here. Even Kosovo Serbs rely on NATO. Mm-hmm. And I leave it at this round here. I think this is where the audience might be interested. It's a lot of unknowns. But my worry is that you have two tracks now. On one track, the EU leaders are busy preparing European Council in December with the consequential decisions on the EU enlargement and on upgrading some countries, especially in the membership line, especially Ukraine and Moldova. At the same time, you have explosive situation that can really explode in your hands by December, which would impact the enlargement perspective of every country in the region, including Montenegro, which still doesn't have a government, therefore we don't have a frontrunner, and therefore it looks very shaky. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'd like to press you a little bit on the sort of waiting game that you were mentioning earlier, because doesn't that mean that the space for things to go wrong, including unplanned things, widens? I mean, is this what you're talking about? The next 3 months, this window, there is a space for things to go wrong?
Next 3 months, and then, I mean, what I didn't mention is that in European politics, 2024 will be also a year of waiting for the European Parliament elections and then, based on the result, constituting the new institutions, so the President of the Commission and the European Council President, and redistribution of power in Brussels. Yeah. So you have really a few months where there will be even more distraction. Okay,
so the window is now to try and at least calm things down. And I'd like to turn to Eric on this. You've had extensive experience here in the Western Balkans. How does it look from your perspective? You know, the security situation, this window that we have now, between now and the end of the year, how does it look like?
Well, I think, you know, having been U.S. ambassador in Sarajevo, we were trying, one of our key objectives was to keep the NATO partnership productive. And the NATO, Bosnia-Herzegovina's path to NATO is supported by a law which was passed by a good consensus 15 years ago. The political discourse now, however, has weakened that consensus. And Milorad Dodik has said, you know, I welcome partnership with NATO. I oppose membership. We will become a member of NATO when Serbia does. Well, that to me, there's some logic there. Yeah. And I think we need to take that at face value. That the challenge then for NATO is to not be used as a political cudgel, that the path for Bosnia-Herzegovina for any member is less important than the journey. And the journey involves raising standards to NATO levels, to European levels. And my experience in this region is that European values are deeply rooted and European standards are very weak. And the leadership, frankly, will be weakened by raising those standards. So there's active opposition, and I think we've taken too many allies have taken their eye off the potential by saying, okay, there's not political consensus in Serbia or in parts of BiH about NATO membership. That doesn't remove the necessity for NATO to lead on building security cooperation, building integrity in the security sector, whether that's through IPAP or through Bosnia-Herzegovina's NATO reform program, which is what they're calling their national plan. It's a menu of reforms that they are asking NATO to help them with. It's very difficult for them politically to develop this plan, but sadly it's even more difficult for them to actually implement any of the reforms. And I think NATO, especially the neighbors in the region, need to look at this more realistically and take this on bilaterally, regionally, to remember that strengthening of the security posture, that the essential steeling the region against the threats, that's what NATO does principally through deterrence.
Okay, thank you very much. And you mentioned strategic posture, and we've also started to talk about 2024, which is what I'd like to discuss in the second round of questions to you. But before we move on to that, yesterday, the final report of the US Strategic Posture Commission was unveiled. Tom, this is your area of work. Can you give us, quickly, what is that about? And again, is it enough to address the threats that are, in Europe, but also more globally?
I have great respect for the very experienced members of the Commission, real experts who put together this report that will have a major influence on the United States and therefore NATO's nuclear arsenal, posture, and doctrine over the next several years. I haven't read all 81 recommendations, but the top line is that in the face of New START treaty expiring in 2026, in the face of a rapid Chinese buildup of its nuclear arsenal, the U.S. must be ready to increase and or modify its current nuclear arsenal. That's understandable where they're coming from, but it is still deeply concerning for me. Perhaps the silver lining in the report is it still says, as every administration has said for 60 years, that arms control is a vital part of a national security strategy, and that this future of an unrestricted three-way nuclear arms race, an arms race that would be more expensive and more dangerous than what we went through during the Cold War, could still be averted if we can get back to negotiation with Russia and, just as difficult, initiate those kind of discussions and negotiations with China as well. That's where I hope we will be. Let me invert for a moment the usual metaphor about the glass being half full or half empty. In the 1970s, the glass was full, was overflowing with nuclear weapons, more than 70,000 in the world. Today, after 50 years of Soviet-American and Russian-American negotiation and cooperation, the glass is less than half full, 12,000 nuclear weapons today. We should not wish to refill that glass. We can do better. And we can use arms control and meaningful negotiations to better protect not just Europe, but the world, and in fact, the existence of the human species from the risk of nuclear war. That requires from NATO and the rest of the world, NATO to continue to insist that our defense policy is not only about deterrence, it is also about seeking to reduce risk and using arms control as a measure. And that's a message that has to get through in Washington and Beijing and Moscow. We can do better than this.
Yeah, but can I ask you, before Russia invaded Ukraine, the US put arms control negotiations on the table with respect to Russia, and Russia declined the offer of talks. I mean, what would it take, in your view, for that conversation to start again?
Well, first, I think it needs to start just as a conversation. This is a piece I published last month that said, this is not the moment for writing a new treaty. It is a moment for the US and Russia to do what the President's National Security Advisor proposed in June, which is discuss, one, how do we reduce the risk of unintentional nuclear conflict at the current moment, and two, what can we do to prevent a renewed nuclear arms race after the New START treaty expires in 2026? That doesn't mean going straight to the text of a new treaty or somehow agreeing to extend the treaty. It means sitting down and having a conversation. That's incredibly difficult on both sides, with both sides saying, how can we talk about anything when we have this fundamental disagreement on Ukraine? But let me remind you that the US and the Soviet Union continued to negotiate nuclear issues when Soviet weapons were killing Americans in Vietnam, when American weapons were killing Soviets in Afghanistan. We still worked on arms control because that's the existential challenge for both countries.
Thank you for that. So the Commission is bipartisan, but we're heading towards elections that could be a game changer in the United States. Rachel, do you think, to what extent should be worried? Should there be a change in administration in the United States? How could the US foreign policy change, especially with respect to NATO and Europe? We remember in 2016, there was a lot of preoccupation about Donald Trump becoming president and the US pulling out of NATO, etc. To what extent are these preoccupations renewed, or to what extent will the institutional system rein in certain excesses? What can we expect?
Sure. So there are a few things that I am sort of worried about looking ahead to 2024. The first is that we've seen support for Ukraine already become used as a political football to sort of drive home domestic politics. So if you've been watching what's been unfolding on Capitol Hill over the last couple of weeks, you saw the historic ouster of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy by a very small but loud and boisterous group of hard-right populists that are sort of bringing to the table this new type of U.S. conservatism. And I don't think it's representative of the majority of the Republican Party, but I do think what that shows is that there is space for the type of rhetoric and opinions that would have once been considered fringe. And so I do think that this is very much going to be a talking point during the upcoming presidential election. We've already seen it become so. Do I think that Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene really care about Ukraine? Not really, but they do care about hamstringing the Biden administration and hamstringing mainstay Republicans so that they can push forward their message. So that's sort of one thing that I'm a little bit worried about. I am also worried about what happens in the upcoming presidential election. And I don't know if that's just because all of us are totally scarred from 2016, where we thought it couldn't happen. So now we're being overly cautious. And I know that it's still a year out, and it's really hard to look at polls that are made now and see Biden and Trump neck and neck, some with Biden a couple points ahead, some with Trump a couple points ahead, and to sort of really take those to heart. But it is concerning given that Trump currently has 91 criminal counts against him, and he is still neck and neck with Biden in terms of polling. So yeah, it is concerning. And what that means for Europe and NATO is concerning as well. I think, all in all, what I would say, and this really has nothing to do with the upcoming election, this has nothing to do with 2024, but looking forward in the US, what I would say is that Biden is going to be the last transatlantic president. And I don't mean that he's going to be the last president that cares about NATO, that cares about Europe. I mean that Biden gets it. He is a dyed-in-the-wool transatlanticist. He's been in this game a really long time. Just look at the people that he has put in the top positions working on Europe and in his administration. It's really important to him. The bench that we're building, both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, are focusing on different things. They're not, they haven't been in this game long enough to understand why the transatlantic relationship needs to be a cornerstone of U.S. Foreign policy and U.S. domestic policy, actually, I would say. And so, I'm not really nervous about the United States, pulling out of NATO or turning back on our U.S. allies, but I am worried about that park Russia mentality that the Biden administration undertook, that in the future that might be a park Europe mentality. And what that means for the transatlantic relationship, I'm not entirely sure.
Thank you, Rachel. No, I agree, and I mentioned earlier that when Russia invaded Ukraine, Washington really shaped the strategy. Europe has stepped up enormously, but it doesn't mean that it can compensate a lack of interest or a drift of US interest in what's happening on the European continent. And of course, 2024, in fact, even before that, 2024 is a big electoral year in the European Union, but in fact, we've already had elections in Slovakia at the end of September. We're going to have elections in Poland on Sunday. So we're embarking on a difficult electoral period in Europe, Milan, and you're based in Berlin, you're from Slovakia, you also follow Central European politics. So how do you think this electoral season is going to influence the sort of very urgent security problems that we have in Europe, including in the Balkans? What do you see? What is your crystal ball telling you?
I don't go into crystal balls, but I would say this. The war has been going on for 1.5 years. There is a natural sort of tiredness with support for Ukraine in the West in general, not only in the US. And at the same time, domestic politics kicks in several countries, and that shows cracks in support for Ukraine, including on the eastern flank. Let's not be naive. The war in Ukraine has not only showed divisions in Europe, European Union between the East and West, but it also divided the East. So Hungary was always there as an outlier, but now you have other countries, and let's not forget about Bulgaria, which was very divided, polarized domestically. And now my own country, Slovakia, shows its own domestic divisions on Ukraine. I don't think that the next government under Robert Fico, number 4, will stop international flows through Slovakia as a neighboring country to Ukraine, which is crucial. Most of German sort of arms supplies go through Slovakia, not only through Poland. But I think he will symbolically do something, maybe stop bilateral ammunition supplies. The stocks are already empty. He will not stop private contracts from armament factories. He's very pragmatic about that, I'm convinced. But it shows, I think the effect of it is, it shows waning support, cracks, which will be explored by Moscow. I think you saw the tweet of Hungarian Prime Minister celebrating Fico's electoral victory. And also, the elections in Poland are strange in a way that this is where Poland, both camps the current government of law and justice, including the opposition led by Platforma Obyvatelska or Donald Tusk, they are staunchly supporting Ukraine. Yet, if you have elections which will be decided by very narrow margins, and you have, what, 12% of undecided, and these 12% are the ones that are feeling that Poland already does too much for Ukraine, then the electoral campaign aims to attract them, and it has anti-Ukrainian tones. This is what happened. Compared to and plus other issues, you have these countries neighboring Ukraine, they will be the direct sort of, they are now net, they are not net payers, they are receivers of EU funding. If Ukraine enters the EU, they will be losers. And what you saw with the Ukrainian agricultural products and wheat was just just the first issue which will need to be, these countries will need to rethink how they approach the enlargement, because they were thinking that Western Balkan candidates are far off and they are small economies, but Ukraine is, their economy would really dump the markets, not only with wheat products, and it's happening too fast. And if you have elections, of course, you want to protect your agriculture producers. So it was messy. I think it will stabilize a little bit after Polish elections. I think it's consequential where Poland will move, also the region will move. And still, I don't like to be fearmonger. I think under crisis, European Union has, especially if it's an existential crisis, European Union has proved that it will hold its act together. But it will be more bumpy, more chaotic. And also, let's not forget this. We have a situation on the eastern flank where a direct confrontation, I mean, Russians are, they have attacked by drones Ukrainian ports on the Danube River, and some of the drones fell on the Romanian territory. If you are very strict, this was attack on NATO territory. The governments of NATO are very vigilant about this, and they are very careful and very also disciplined not to overdo it. But Russia is careless, and what happened between Finland on the pipeline between Finland and Estonia is another example where they can be also probing. And so it's a dangerous situation. We have domestic weakness in several countries that might send a signal, I think a false signal of weakness. I think we will get through, but it will be a nervous sort of...
Yeah, and Moldova's national security strategy was also unveiled the other day, and the president of Moldova was saying, you know, the Russian goal is to, you know, end Moldova as a state. I think she used liquefy as a verb, which is quite a powerful one. And also going back to European politics and the travails of electoral politics, which are, you know, it's part of democracy. Notwithstanding the question of support towards Ukraine, you also have the degree to which the European Union as a whole has to negotiate with all these various components and contestation within, and how much energy and time and diplomatic resources it has to dedicate to keeping that unity, be it with respect to Ukraine, be it with respect to enlargement, be it with respect to the Balkans, be it with respect to NATO in the region, etc. So what I'd like to do now, we've put a lot out there, you know, the Balkans, NATO, arms control, politics in 2024. So I'm assuming that there are people who would like to make comments or contributions to this discussion. Please, thank you for breaking the ice. We have microphones coming. And if I could ask you to introduce yourself and, you know, fire a question or a comment to anyone or to everyone.
Thank you very much. I'm Marina Kostic-Šurić. I'm head of the Center for Non-Proliferation, Arms Control and Disarmament here from Belgrade. And also I'm research fellow at the Institute of International Politics and Economics. So I wanted to ask Mr. Thomas, what do you think, because I wrote an article about the comprehensive arms control in Europe, so do you think we can have in the future some combination of conventional and nuclear arms control in Europe, or something like we had in the nuclear and space talks, for example, in the 80s? And I also wanted to ask, sorry, I forgot the name, but about the Balkans. What do you
Milan.
think about the development or possible development of a Kosovo army? Because we have a regional arms control regime here in the Balkans. Do you perceive, and how you perceive that Kosovo possible army? I mean, we are in Belgrade. We have a constitution of Serbia which says that Kosovo and Metohija is autonomous province of Serbia. But we know that it is considered for Kosovo to become part of NATO. So what about the NATO enlargement regarding Kosovo? Where are the eastern borders of NATO? Is there a global NATO? I mean, that is a lot of questions I'm just saying. But regarding Kosovo army, I'm interested. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were several questions in one. So I'd like to turn to Tom first, and then Milan and Eric perhaps for the second part. And in the meantime, I'm keeping my eyes open for other hands that might want to come up and contribute to the discussion. Please, Tom.
So first, my association, the Arms Control Association, focuses a little more on nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction than on conventional weapons. But a couple of comments about what is possible in Europe when the war in Ukraine is finished. We could return to some of the positive developments of the 1980s in terms of both nuclear and conventional arms control in Europe. The big Gorbachev-Reagan breakthrough, the Intermediate Forces Treaty, was violated by Russia, caused the United States to withdraw. But 4 years after the treaty died, the US has not yet deployed intermediate-range missiles in Europe. And there remains a possibility that we could avoid that level of escalation. The kind of conventional forces agreement, the multilateral treaties negotiated in Vienna are essentially Russia stopped honoring them years ago. It's very difficult to imagine how you would restructure those, but it is dependent upon the outcome of the war in Ukraine. But it would be irresponsible to say it's impossible. Centers like yours, politicians, diplomats, need to focus on what is possible, and without question, a new conventional arms structure in Europe could be of reassurance to both Russia and to the NATO and its partners.
Milan, do you want to add as well?
Let me maybe add one sentence that the arms control regime in Europe especially is not only about the US and Russia, right? There are other countries, not only nuclear powers like France and Britain that want to be part of it, but also in Berlin where I sit, there is a lot of attention and conversation about this. Now, on your questions about Kosovo army, look, ever since Kosovo declared independence, it was clear that Kosovo will want to have an army. They cannot have an army just by their own sort of adventure. They have to have a build-up of their security forces in cooperation with NATO, because NATO is, through KFOR, the security provider for the whole of Kosovo. As you know, NATO is divided on that because there are 4 members that don't recognize Kosovo. And it is also a piece that can throw the balance out. So I think it is a reality that one day Kosovo will have an army. They are building their own forces. That army will be much smaller than Serbia has. But what worries me is that there was, until last year at least, there was some kind of a game that was predictable between Belgrade and Pristina. That sometimes it's completely surprise balls, like the land swap that was agreed between President of Serbia and President of Kosovo, but prevented by the international community. but it was not out of control. Now, increasingly, my personal opinion and my personal worry, as I look at the situation of the last few weeks, I see elements of out of control there, right? Because what's the future of the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia after Banska? Even though it's all about the association, I heard about Quint coming back to the region in coming days, trying to restart negotiations on the association. Can you do it after that? There are many pieces. I think still the underlining arrangement is there through K4, because also US commitment to European security is unquestionable under this administration. But I think increasingly, because, again, my lesson from the South Caucasus is that the weakness of Russia was explored by the stronger country, by Azerbaijan, in tacit agreement with Russia to rewrite the regional order and Turkey. And as we move to the future, post-2024, the adventurism of leaders here in the region will be, I mean, we'll have more opportunities to be shown. So let me leave it at that.
So Eric, I'd like you to address the question, but also perhaps about this, the space for things to go wrong in Serbia, Kosovo, if you're at liberty to do so. But just a very brief comment. The context is different, but December 2020, Azerbaijan's incursion into Nagorno-Karabakh, nobody was expecting Azerbaijan to win. And the military balance of power changed because of drones, because of technology. But nobody was expecting it. So actually, the outcome of it was something that the international community had sort of woke up to rather with a bit of a surprise. Huh?
And also, if I may say, but it's very important, in terms of international law, Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan, right? So
yes, exactly.
The moment, but it might not be finished. The moment that Baku will move on the corridor to Nakhichevan through Armenia proper, again, everything changes from the position of territorial integrity and international law.
So caution, but there are also differences in the context. So Eric, please.
So I would add that I would not describe KFOR or NATO as the guarantor of security in Kosovo, or as the provider. I'm sorry, as the provider of security. They're the guarantor. That's the Security Council resolution. So who provides security in Kosovo needs to be local authorities. And building that capacity so that all Kosovan citizens feel adequately protected is a primary objective. And I think one of the biggest disappointments of recent developments in Kosovo was the withdrawal, the en masse withdrawal of Serb Kosovans from the security institutions, because there'd been tremendous favorable progress on building security institutions that were well integrated. So that's a big loss. And I think that NATO has a key role to play. And it's important to appreciate that KFOR's role in guaranteeing that peace and bringing some stability to the region is widely appreciated. I was struck by this morning's discussion about the Good Friday agreements for Northern Ireland that said without both Northern Ireland, the UK, and Ireland having been together in the EU, that agreement likely would have been impossible. So this is where the Kosovo-Serbia disputes overlap and need to be integrated then to the integration with NATO and the EU. That if NATO and the EU are the architecture in whatever form for the region, for really stabilizing peace and prosperity, I think that's the best prospects for the region. And that's a path that we need to move forward on.
And if I just say, I mean, I think it was great to have a panel on the Good Friday Agreement. And I remember when it was reached, I was living in London, and the courage that it took a number of individuals to get to the point in which the Good Friday Agreement could be reached. It's quite extraordinary. So I have a gentleman here, and then Sonia first, it's fine. Okay. Sonia Stojanovic.
Yes, thank you. I have a question not related to the Balkans, and this is whether you see Transatlantic Alliance alive in any continent beyond Europe. So Latin America, Africa, Asia, is there any alliance there? And especially in regards to recent developments with expansion of BRICS. And the second question I want to ask, within Europe, besides unity in containing Russia, which are the areas where EU and US interests compete? We know about digital, but for example, what's interesting for our region is also extractive industries and type of development. So are all bets open when it comes to who is going to get the important mineral first?
Thank you very much. And just in front of you, Sonia, we have another question. And then I'm going to look around the room to see if anyone else would like to contribute, because we need to think about bringing this discussion to an end. Fine, so please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for a very interesting panel. My name is Jonas, and I work at the Danish Embassy. I would like to ask the panelists, what is and what do you think should be the long-term plan for European security architecture? Should NATO function as deterrence of Russia in 5, 10, 20 years? Do you see the OSCE or some other institution playing a crucial role for European security on the longer term? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a nice open-ended closing question. So what I'll do, I'll start with Rachel. And if you could start with Sonia's question, perhaps first, and then move on to some more general considerations. And you have a couple of minutes each, so we'll be fine.
No, I think you make a really interesting point. I think one of the most interesting things sort of in the geopolitical context today is sort of this rise of the others. You know, we're looking at institutions like the BRICS and the G20 as forums where countries that might not have as powerful of a voice really be able to sort of push their agendas. And when I say that, I'm thinking specifically about India and China as two countries that really see themselves as vying for the voice of the global South, as we've come to call it. You know, what I think is interesting when you look at an organization like the G7, for example. In terms of, you know, purchasing power parity, it reached its peak in the 80s at like 70% of global GDP, and that has declined. It's about 45% right now, and the BRICS has surpassed it. And so we are seeing a situation where the US-European relationship, I think, needs to be put into a broader context, and both sides of the Atlantic need to think more clearly about what their future relationship with a country like India might look like, how they can build more successful partnerships with the BRICS countries, with countries in Africa in general. There's obviously a difference between the global South and the power South, the power South, which really pushes, the voice of the global South writ large. But I do think that this is something that the US and Europe are both thinking about and that will, build on going forward. It's really interesting, traveling to India and Rwanda and Brazil this past year, not so much the conversations I heard, but the conversations that I didn't hear. And really what I didn't hear was anything about Ukraine. And what I did hear was a lot of conversations about the importance of building and deepening relationships with China. So I just thought that was interesting. In terms of the long-planned security architecture for Europe, I think the real problem is that it's sort of, what we've done at this point, I think, is linked the European security architecture with whatever U.S. president is in office. So Biden's message was the U.S. is back, and I think that maybe looking back on it, they could have rephrased that a little bit. And when you look at the Trump administration, it was very much a push to try to get Europe to act on its own. Although I do think that we've had sort of a hypocritical approach to European security, where we say that we want the Europeans to do more, but then when they try to actually build their defense industrial base, we say we don't want you to do it like that, actually. And so I really think we have to think in terms of like 10 or 20 years down the road. Where do we want Europe's defense industrial base to be? And that is going to mean, I think, the U.S. taking a little bit of a hit, perhaps, and that's not going to be easy for a lot of people. But I think if we want a stronger European security architecture and a stronger U.S.-European relationship in general, then we have to have a stronger Europe in terms of their own security and defense base. So that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Eric. I see you're, sorry, Tom, I see you're nodding, so do you want to go for next?
I was agreeing with that, but let me make two quick comments on the questions raised. Are there going to be more military alliances like NATO? I think the short answer is no. The U.S. went through that fad in the 50s and 60s of building formal alliances in Asia and the Middle East, and it's not going to happen again. The closest we will come is the fact that South Korea and Japan need to cooperate more closely. They face a daily threat from North Korea and a potential threat from China. And I don't think they'll crystallize that relationship in a military alliance, but I hope they will become much better military coordination partners. The other part of it is there are still nations, such as Saudi Arabia right now, that would like to get an American security guarantee. I think that's going to be very difficult, but it would change the situation in the Middle East. Quick comment on OSCE. It is very sad that Russian and Belarusian obstruction in Vienna has prevented the OSCE from doing the unpublicized work that it has done very well in the Western Balkans, in the Caucasus, and elsewhere. And I have no idea how to fix that before this war is over.
Yeah, because we do need that unpublicized work. Eric, I'll turn to you.
The transatlantic alliance that we need and how it projects itself in the world, I don't share the, I see the glass as much more than half full, and especially it's been strengthened in the last few years. One note is the Munich Security Conference this year, 10% of the US Congress was in attendance. That's a record number. And Majority Leader McConnell said, I brought a Republican-only delegation here because I wanted it to be clear what Republican leadership, how Republican leadership believes in the importance of defending Ukraine and supporting the Transatlantic Alliance. So while the rhetoric at the top, can shift with the winds, I think there is a deep appreciation for the essential value of our European partners, the great success of this partnership that we've built over decades. It cannot be taken for granted, and I think that we, in every election cycle within the alliance, it's important to, we all hope our political leaders would take the long-term view and not look for short-term manipulation and gain, but often we see that in electoral games. But I think this is a time when everyone should be reminded of how we're bound by our values. Our shared values across the Atlantic are our strength. And the contrast with others, even with the BRICS, is stark. At the same time, it's a different globe. We have a much stronger Korea and Japan, which have common defense interests, who are key allies of ours. So we address India as an important democratic partner as well. So I think the Biden administration has been very clear in saying America succeeds in partnership with others, and we are determined to partner with those who share our values.
Milan, you have the last word.
Let me start with trying to answer very briefly Sonia's question about transatlantic alliance outside of Europe. I think that's now on the table. The US expects Europeans within NATO context to also help, be present with some capability focus sort of outstretched to Asia Pacific. I think it's possible that the Transatlantic Alliance will become more transactional, regardless of how the presidential elections in the US will go. And I see European security still be, in 10 years' time, be based on NATO, because that's how even your neighbors, Finland, Sweden, feel. They want to go under NATO's umbrella. So Serbia might be the one odd country out there, but it's still the arrangement with NATO. Belgrade's arrangement with NATO will be still here, I hope, a very important part of the security, overall security. And I think OSCE, let's see, I think it's dying, and there is still a search for another type of organization where you can discuss security, new format like Macron initiated the European political community, but after a summit in Granada, I really don't know what's the future of that format except the talking shop. So the jury's out, but I think the Western Balkans is a region where new trends or some new crises and dominoes can be started. So I'm worried, and I'm reminding my colleagues that the questions of territory and borders are not settled here. And this is where we all depend on the security arrangement and European integration going forward.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience for being with us, for asking really great questions. And I'd also like to ask you to join me in thanking our fantastic panelists. This was a really great debate. We went in all sorts of directions, but I think we managed to keep the thread together. So thank you very much.